Bigfoot sightings have been exploding in Ohio this March, and I've spent days cross-referencing those sightings against geological surveys and Meteor databases expecting noise, but instead I found a pattern that only points into one direction. The Sasquatch people are seeing in Ohio didn't walk here from another forest. It secretly came from somewhere much farther away. The first report was Adams County, March 4th. A hiker posted to a hiking community forum describing a Bigfoot figure estimated at 8 to 9 feet tall, covered in dark, matted fur that didn't just absorb the dim morning light, but seemed to swallow it entirely. The description alone was striking, but what caught my attention immediately was the complete silence the witness emphasized. A silence that felt less like a natural absence of sound and more like the vacuum of space somehow intruding into the forest. I've read a lot of sighting reports. Witnesses almost always fixate on sound. A grunt, a branch snap, something that roots the encounter in the physical world. This one had nothing. That absence kept nagging at me in a way I couldn't explain yet. The hiker made it clear that when Bigfoot moved, which it eventually did, not a single sound accompanied it. No snapping twigs underfoot, no rustle of leaves along its path, nothing that would indicate any physical interaction with the environment at all. It wasn't just quiet. It was as if the usual rules of physics had stopped applying in a small radius around it. The forest itself seemed to hold its breath, as though displaced by something that didn't belong to Earth in the first place. Attached to the post was a blurry trail photo. I spent hours examining that image, scrutinizing every shadow, every shape that could be mistaken for a tree or a large bush. The shape in the background was unmistakably upright and massive, undeniably animate, and not a tree in any way. The proportions suggested something much larger than a human, far taller than anything normally wandering the woods of southern Ohio. But what stood out more the longer I looked was the way the light bent around Bigfoot. Not naturally, not like shadow, but like gravitational distortion, as if the figure wasn't just standing there, but partially existing somewhere else entirely, something closer to orbit than soil. But there was one more thing in that photo, faint, easy to dismiss, but there in the background behind Bigfoot, a wide, shallow depression in the terrain. Not a ravine, not a sinkhole, something older looking, like the land had been pushed in from above long ago and had spent millions of years slowly trying to forget it. I didn't know what to make of that yet. I filed it away. I found myself repeatedly asking the same question over and over. How does a creature of this magnitude move through a forest without producing any sound? How does Bigfoot displace air, shift mass, and yet leave behind no acoustic footprint whatsoever, as if it isn't interacting with the atmosphere the way anything on Earth should? How does it avoid snapping branches or crushing undergrowth, and yet leave no trace beyond a faint outline in a grainy photograph? Every time I returned to that image, it seemed to grow larger in my mind, more impossible, more real. Not just an undiscovered animal, but something operating under a completely different set of physical rules, something that felt less terrestrial the longer I thought about it. The second Bigfoot report came from Pike County, March 9th. Unlike the first, this was not a fleeting visual observation. It was evidence that could be measured, examined, and analyzed. A farmer reported waking up early one morning to find that something had torn violently through a fence line on his property. He described the moment he stepped outside as strangely disorienting, mentioning that the air felt off, thinner somehow, like the pressure had dropped overnight without explanation. The difference between this and a normal encounter with wildlife was stark. The fence wasn't knocked over or forced open in a conventional sense. It had been ripped apart, splintered boards scattered in jagged patterns, wire twisted and severed, as though the force came from something impossibly strong. But the damage pattern didn't radiate outward the way brute force normally behaves. It looked centralized, almost as if the fence had been stressed from a single point and then failed all at once, like material exposed to an intense, localized force field. Behind this destruction lay Bigfoot's large footprints, pressed into the wet soil, 17 inches long and 3 inches deep. The ridge is one of the hallmark identifiers for Bigfoot tracks, and there it was, perfectly formed in the Pike County soil. The implications were unavoidable. Whatever left these prints was not a bear, not any animal we could normally expect, and certainly not human. It was a Sasquatch, but even that label started to feel insufficient, more like a placeholder than an explanation, a name I assign because I don't have a better one. And then there was one detail the farmer mentioned almost as an afterthought, the kind of thing a witness throws in because they don't know what to do with it. He said there were small, dark metallic fragments scattered near the base of the torn fence posts. He thought they were old hardware, maybe rust flakes off the wire, but they were in the soil, not on the wire, pressed into the ground near the deepest footprints. I couldn't stop thinking about them, because fragments like that don't just appear, not in freshly disturbed ground, not unless something brought them with it from somewhere else entirely. The third Bigfoot report came from Scioto County, March 14th. A fisherman uploaded a Bigfoot video to YouTube, and though it was removed relatively quickly, I located an archived mirror that preserved the footage. The video had been shot on a phone using a thermal imaging application, the kind that translates heat into color-coded visuals, revealing Bigfoot even in near-complete darkness. The footage showed the far bank of a winding river, and there, moving slowly but deliberately through the underbrush, was unmistakably large. When I say large, I mean enormous. A size clearly beyond that of any human or any animal naturally inhabiting Ohio's woodlands. What made the footage particularly striking was the movement. Bigfoot walked fully upright, not hunched, not on all fours, not staggering or dragging limbs. It carried itself with a gait that no bear, no deer, no human could mimic. I paused the video, enlarged the thermal signature, and studied it meticulously. Every movement was measured, deliberate, and fully upright, with proportions that reinforced the impression of a towering bipedal creature far beyond ordinary scale. I watched the clip repeatedly, frame by frame, searching for inconsistencies or signs of human trickery, and found none. This was not a human, not any animal I could identify. It was something extraordinary. What I kept returning to, though, wasn't Bigfoot. It was the heat signature itself. It was wrong. Not wrong like a hoax, wrong like I'd never seen a thermal profile distributed that way on a living thing. The heat concentrated in odd bands across the torso, not in the patterns you'd expect from mammalian biology. I'm not a thermal imaging expert, but I've seen enough wildlife footage to know what a warm-blooded animal looks like through that lens. This was something else, something far different from the Bigfoot we know. The fourth Bigfoot report, actually two separate reports, came from Highland County, March 19th. Two witnesses, independently, 11 miles apart, reported the same phenomenon on the same night. Before either of them described seeing the Sasquatch itself, both of them mentioned the same unexpected detail, a powerful, overwhelming sulfur smell. One witness described the odor as so intense it caused their eyes to water. The other assumed there was a gas leak in the area. Neither made the connection between the smell and the creature they eventually encountered, but I immediately noted it as significant, writing it in my files in all caps. Sulfur. Remember the sulfur. It might seem like a small, almost incidental detail, but it became one of the threads connecting all of these sightings, a sensory clue that tied Adams, Pike, Scioto, and Highland counties together in a pattern that defied coincidence. And here's the thing about sulfur that I want you to hold on to. It doesn't just appear randomly in forest soil in Ohio. It has to come from somewhere, a mineral source, a chemical reaction, something releasing it under pressure. I didn't have the answer yet, but I knew the moment I typed that word in capital letters that the answer was going to change everything. When I plotted all four Bigfoot reports on a map, they didn't disperse across the region as random occurrences might. Instead, they clustered, forming a tight, specific knot in the southern part of the state, all drawing toward the same patch of land. The pattern was unmistakable and unsettling, suggesting an intentional convergence rather than chance. At that point, I realized something about this investigation that unsettled me profoundly. Not wrong like an error in data collection, not mistaken like misreading a map or misunderstanding a report. Wrong in a deeper sense, as if the answer to these sightings was something entirely beyond expectation, something I was not prepared to confront. I need you to stay with me here, because what I am about to explain is not a hypothesis, not speculation, but a verified geological fact. The moment I encountered this information, the pattern of sightings, the sulfur reports, and the massive footprints all began to make sense. Every single Bigfoot report clustered directly over a single feature in the landscape, a feature that had existed long before humans ever observed it. Serpent Mound, the area where all of these sightings are, sits directly atop a confirmed impact crater, not suspected, not theoretical. It was confirmed and verified. Beneath it, every pin I had dropped on my map aligned with unnerving precision. The crater measures roughly 5 miles across. Though it formed hundreds of millions of years ago, meaning the impact has been largely eroded, its geological signatures remain intact and measurable. Shattered bedrock, shocked quartz, and deformed strata, all unmistakable signs of an extraordinary meteor impact event. Every Bigfoot sighting I tracked sat squarely above this ancient scar. I pulled my sighting map back up and I zoomed in again on southern Ohio. The pattern of sightings was still there, tight and almost unnervingly neat, but this time I wanted to add another layer of data. I pulled up the boundary of the impact structure, the Meteor crater that Serpent Mound sits atop, and overlaid it directly onto the map. I adjusted the transparency, shifted the layers back and forth, and stared at them, tracing the outlines with my finger. Every time I moved one layer, the alignment seemed almost too precise to be random, and a creeping sense of disbelief started to settle in. And when I looked at the other Bigfoot sightings, Pike, Scioto, Highland counties, all of them formed a tight network that converged on the same spot. The cluster wasn't just pointing toward Serpent Mound. It was centered on it, and the precision of that centering made my chest tighten. It was no longer a coincidence. It was a destination. I got up from my desk. I didn't close the laptop. I didn't even minimize the map. I just stood up and walked across the room, letting my gaze wander out the window, thinking, turning, pacing slightly as I tried to process what the map was showing me. Because at that moment, this was no longer a simple pattern. This was a location, a place that Bigfoot, something enormous, something unaccounted for, had been returning to repeatedly. Not wandering by chance, not drifting. It was somehow returning. And that location was not just some arbitrary patch of forest or farmland. It was a scar on the earth itself, a site where an object had struck with unimaginable force hundreds of millions of years ago, leaving behind geological markers that had persisted through eons. The question I had started with, why were these Bigfoot sightings clustered in such a narrow region? Why did they converge on southern Ohio? Had just been answered in a way I hadn't anticipated. And the answer was terrifying in its implications. It wasn't the kind of revelation you could shrug off or rationalize easily. It had opened a door, a threshold into a concept I wasn't sure I was ready to cross. A realization that connected the biology of Bigfoot we barely understood to a planetary-scale geological event that had occurred long before humans walked: the Earth. I leaned closer to the screen, thinking about what that meant for a creature moving through the area. Bigfoot traversing that ground, stepping over bedrock that had not been disturbed for hundreds of millions of years, would be physically interacting with material that had literally been untouched since before the age of reptiles, before mammals, before humans. Every footprint, every brush with the soil, would be disturbing minerals that had survived entire eons without alteration. That thought alone made the hair on my arms stand on end. It was no longer just a creature wandering in the forest. Bigfoot was moving through geological history itself, tracing a path that intersected with a scar left by a cataclysm older than life as we know it. The implications began to multiply in my mind. This wasn't random wandering or territorial roaming. This wasn't migration, hunting, or mating behavior in any traditional sense we understood. It was something else entirely, something drawn to a location with a permanence and significance so profound it had persisted through the entire span of Earth's known history. I could feel, almost physically, the weight of that realization pressing down, and I sat back slightly, letting it sink in, staring at the screen and the overlay again, tracing the convergence of sighting pins and impact boundary over and over, until it became undeniable. Bigfoot was returning to a very specific place, over and over, a place shaped by forces beyond comprehension, and everything I had documented, every sulfur smell, every footprint, every thermal signature, every blurry photograph, was connected. And that's when I remembered the sulfur. Then I went back to the sulfur smell, the one both Highland County Bigfoot witnesses reported on March 19th before they ever laid eyes on anything. I looked up which minerals are commonly found in other rock fragments and in large-scale impact formations. Sulfur compounds appeared on that list, specifically a mineral called troilite, which is a form of iron sulfide. Troilite is one of the most commonly identified minerals in those types of samples. If something as large and heavy as Bigfoot was moving through the Serpent Mound impact zone, disturbing ancient buried rock and mineral deposits with every step, the chemical compounds released into the surrounding air would include sulfur. It would hit you like a wall before you ever saw what caused it. Two witnesses 11 miles apart on the same night. Neither of them knew about the other's report. Neither of them knew anything about meteorite impact chemistry. They just both described the same smell, unprompted, and it matched exactly what the geology predicted would happen if something enormous was moving through that crater. That should have been the end of it. I had a location, I had physical evidence, I had the chemistry lining up. Any reasonable person would have stopped there. I could not stop there, because I had one question left that I couldn't let go of. Where did the rock come from? And I had no idea that question was going to take me somewhere I was completely unprepared to go. Something was moving through that crater. If Bigfoot is active through that impact site, is it passing through, or is it returning to something? I started researching the origin of the impactor itself. What kind of rock makes a crater 5 miles wide? What it would have been carrying when it hit? I expected to find geology. I expected to find impact physics. I did not expect to find what I found. That's when I stumbled upon panspermia. Panspermia is a real peer-reviewed hypothesis. Life, or its building blocks, can travel on meteorites and seed planets. Space isn't necessarily a barrier to biology. If it's even partly true, the question of where Bigfoot came from shifts into something scientific. I found references to this on NASA's own website. Then, I found something more specific. In recent years, a space mission brought back samples from an asteroid. Scientists detected a nucleobase, one of the basic building blocks of molecules all living things use to help carry and use genetic instructions. Not theoretical, physically found inside a space rock. If that exists in a random asteroid, then a much larger impactor, one that formed a several-mile-wide crater, becomes biologically relevant. I also came across a research abstract discussing extremophiles, organisms that can survive extreme heat, cold, radiation, and even the vacuum of space. The idea was straightforward. Biological resilience is often underestimated, and the upper limit of what could survive space travel inside a large meteorite is still unknown. Could Bigfoot come from this? Genuinely open. I kept coming back to that. If the upper limit is unknown, then we don't actually know what couldn't survive. And Bigfoot had been moving through that impact zone all month. I pulled historical records from the Ohio. History connection. The indigenous builders of Serpent Mound considered the site sacred and aligned it with celestial events. They understood the ground was different. No modern tools, but they encoded that difference into the landscape, and they lived alongside whatever was in those woods long before any online reports. I sat with that, a monument to the sky placed where the sky once came down. And whatever was moving through that zone in March 2026 may have been there, in some form, far longer than recorded history. Every Bigfoot sighting in Ohio that month radiated from that zone. Sulfur smells, footprints, thermal hits, the silent 9-foot figure at the tree line, all converging. Centered on a buried impact structure in southern Ohio. I had the crater, the chemistry, the biology. I thought I was done. Then I made one more search, just to close the tab, and everything cracked open again. I opened the Meteoritical Society database, filtered by origin, didn't know what I was looking for. Then I saw it. Martian. Dozens of entries, confirmed Martian meteorites, recovered worldwide, sitting in labs. Not theory. Physical rocks from Mars. The confirmation method matters. Impacts on Mars eject surface material into space. Scientists analyze trapped gas inside those rocks and match it to Mars's atmosphere, measured by Viking landers in the 1970s. Exact match. I read the full explanation. It was airtight. Then I checked North America. Martian meteorites have been found here. That's documented. Mars has already sent material to Earth. The pathway exists. I pulled NASA's research on Mars. Billions of years ago. Liquid water, thicker atmosphere, potentially habitable. That overlaps with the late heavy bombardment 3 to 4 billion years ago, when impacts were constant. Mars, with lower gravity, could eject debris more easily. If something lived there, some of it could have left with that debris. Then I checked the age of the Serpent Mound crater. It falls within, or near that same era. The same window that could have launched Martian material is the one that sent something into southern Ohio. The same crater tied to every sighting this month, and evolved into Bigfoot. I stopped typing, just stared at the screen. Then, the chemistry. I pulled mineral data for Martian meteorites. Olivine, pyroxene, iron sulfides, specifically troilite. The same mineral is linked to Serpent Mound deposits, the same compound that can produce a sulfur smell when disturbed. The same smell was reported by 2 Bigfoot witnesses 11 miles apart, same night, before either saw anything. The smell wasn't a detail, it was a signature. I wrote it out as a chain. Mars was habitable during the late heavy bombardment. Impacts ejected material into space. Martian meteorites have reached North America. The Serpent Mound crater dates to that era. Its geology is anomalous. It contains troilite. 2 witnesses reported sulfur before sightings. Every March 2026 sighting clusters over that structure. Somewhere in the middle of writing that chain out, it stopped feeling like speculation and started feeling like a conclusion I didn't want to admit. If the material came from Mars, if the chemistry lines up, if the pattern of sightings locks onto that impact site with that same sulfur signature, then I'm not just looking at an unknown animal anymore. I'm looking at something that traces back off this planet. And once that thought settled in, I couldn't shake it, that whatever people have been calling Bigfoot all this time might not be from here at all, but something that originated on Mars and has been here far longer than we've been paying attention. The rock that made Serpent Mound came from out there. Other rocks just like it have already landed on this continent, and Bigfoot has been in those southern Ohio woods longer than any of us can fully comprehend, and it's moving through that impact zone right now.